What is Flipped Learning is one of the most popular videos on this channel. It's a great approach for innovative learning and teaching, but it's often ill-defined. So in this video, we're going to build upon that video and talk more explicitly about how you can design flipped learning experiences for your students. My name's Chris, his name's Chris, and we are Blade, dedicated to keeping educators at the cutting edge of blended learning and digital education. If you like our content, please give us a like, a thumbs up, and subscribe to the channel. Okay, so in this video, we're going to provide a brief explanation of what flipped learning is, why it's a useful approach for learning and teaching in your students, and how you can start designing a flipped learning experience. Okay, so let's start by looking at what flipped learning is. And this is a brief overview of the more detailed video, what is flipped learning. But one of the fundamental starting points, I think, when it comes to designing flipped learning is to not make this mistake. So many educators, whether it's they have a session, whether it's 4 hours, whether it's 3 hours, whether it's 1 hour, they have an existing session and they want to do it flipped, so they add on some pre-learning in the online space. This is a big no-no. The reason being that this is a developed session that should be meeting certain learning outcomes. Adding on more content leads to what we call course bloat. So students can see if that content is really relevant or not, and they're quite likely to disengage with it. The educator thinks flipped learning is not working for me, the students are not doing the pre-learning material, and it all kind of falls down. So what we promote instead is that you see flipped learning as a redistribution of learning across two environments. One environment is the synchronous environment, and one environment is the asynchronous environment. So the synchronous environment is the live environment. So that could be live online via Zoom or something similar, or it could be on campus. So this is generally where people are together, students are together in a group, in the same space at the same time. Then the asynchronous environment, therefore, is we call the self-directed, the flexible online environment where content is engaged with at a time and a location that is convenient for the learner. So once we have these two environments, if we have an existing session, we start thinking about where are these outcomes for this session best met. Now, we might see a proportion of the session is actually best delivered or best achieved in the asynchronous, self-directed, flexible online learning space. To understand what has been understood during this asynchronous content, we must link it to some formative assessment or assessment for learning. This can happen at the beginning of your on-campus or live session, or it can also be embedded into the asynchronous space. But the idea here is that you've delivered some content, had some activities, so that when you have your students together in the group space, you can go deeper, faster, more engaging, more collaborative in the topic at hand. What this looks like over a distribution of a number of sessions could be something like this. So you see that I've actually reduced the live session time because that content has been achieved, those outcomes have been achieved in the asynchronous space. So there's no need to add on. In fact, I actually reduced the time needed with those learners. I've given a very kind of formal overview here of the distribution, but in reality, when you're designing this for yourself and implementing it over a number of iterations, you may kind of decide that you want more asynchronous time to start with, and therefore you'd reduce the synchronous time, or maybe you'd build up as the sessions went on, you want more synchronous time towards the middle or the end. This is something for you to work on in the future designs and future iterations as you go forward. But why would you spend time and effort designing your sessions in this way? What's the benefit? Obviously, from a learner perspective, it increases flexibility, gives them more options of when and where they're engaging with learning content. So they're not restricted purely to the physical or the live learning environment. There's been lots of research around the value of educator presence. So feeling supported and guided in your learning experience. The value that the flipped learning model brings to this is that in the synchronous live on-campus space, educator presence can be felt through increased facilitation and coaching of learners. And the research has shown that even in the asynchronous space, your curation or creation of digital learning content puts your fingerprint in that space, and learners feel like they are getting supported from you even when you're not there. Similarly, with educator presence, the value of community, of feeling part of a cohort, is seen in the literature as being very valuable. And you can build community starting with the asynchronous environment, getting students to maybe share and upload videos introducing themselves, and this community can be further fostered in the on-campus, in-person synchronous time. One really valuable approach, I think, to flipped learning and more asynchronous learning environments is development of learners' executive functioning skills. So these are skills like flexible thinking, working memory development, self-monitoring, planning and prioritization, task initiation, organization, etc. These are all skills that we associate with lifelong learning, and these are skills that seem to be needed more and more in our learners, and they're not often explicitly developed. So by giving students content in the asynchronous learning environment, you're shifting the focus onto them to be responsible for their learning, and in turn helping them develop these executive functioning skills. All of this combined, having this outcomes-focused approach, leads to greater success in a learning experience, which in turn leads to increased satisfaction. Additionally, having asynchronous content allows us to represent information in different ways. So we're all dealing with huge variability of learners, whether it's cognitive variability, physical variability. Everyone has a different challenge and need, let's say, when approaching learning. So by us presenting information in different formats and modalities helps us to reach a wider audience. So how can you start designing your flipped learning sessions specifically? Well, it's important to consider that you may have discipline knowledge or content knowledge in this case in a specific area, but it's important to keep developing and fostering your pedagogical knowledge. So what are the new innovative evidence-based approaches to learning and teaching? And also, how can technology support you in the design and delivery of your educational experience? So considering the three aspects of technology, pedagogy, and content are key in personal educator development. And one approach that we can take that's a development in pedagogical knowledge is by utilizing evidence-based learning design approaches. So this very simple model looks straightforward, but it's called a backward design approach. And what it intends to do is to stop educators thinking about designing a learning experience in a content-first approach. So thinking about, okay, I've got a 1 hour lecture, what content am I going to deliver in that 1 hour? We want to stop doing that. Instead, we want to shift to an outcomes-focused approach. So we're thinking about, what are the outcomes for this session? How will I know that those outcomes have been achieved? By developing assessments and activities linked to those outcomes, And only then, when you have the two goalposts in place, do you even think about learning content and where that learning content is best delivered in the synchronous or asynchronous environment. So if we were to map out a module or a subject, we would have some high-level learning outcomes, maybe 3 to 4. And then we would have some very clearly defined summative assessments that were explicitly linked to those module or subject or course level learning outcomes. Once that's been done, you can then start thinking about your sessions within your subject, your module, your course, however you want to call it. And each session should have 2 to 3 session level learning outcomes or session level learning objectives. Again, whichever terminology you're using, you have a high level outcome and you have the more kind of granular level outcome. And these granular level learning outcomes all link up to achieve your subject level learning outcomes or your course level learning outcomes. Now, at specific points, you want to know if these outcomes are being met. So you have 2 to 3 summative assessments, however you want to design that. I would argue that every session should have formative assessment or assessment for learning for you to understand to what degree these subject level outcomes, these session level outcomes are being met. Now, once you've done this mapping exercise, which is really key to keep you in a very kind of streamlined, focused approach to your education design, let's look at one specific session. And this is where I promote a chunking and sequencing of the session content and activities. So we know what subject level outcomes we're aiming for. We know what our summative assessments are. Let's think about how we get there. So then we're starting to think about, in relation to our model, now we're already starting to think about learning content. So we've got topics that we'll deliver and activities. And in this case, these two things together will show me that learning outcome 1 has been achieved. These two things show me that learning outcome 2 have been achieved. And these 3 things show me that learning outcome 3 has been achieved on the session level. Now, this is where we really start thinking about the outcomes approach linking to the flipped learning model. Because if I have a learning outcome that is deemed to be lower order thinking, so the learning outcomes have been developed based on Bloom's revised taxonomy. So if it's lower order thinking, so if it's to define something or remember something, then this is best delivered, I think, in the asynchronous individual space. So rather than you deliver it in the classroom in a one-way kind of approach, let the student go through that content on their own. And then if you have higher order outcomes, so they might need to synthesize information or create something or show their understanding in a more kind of meaningful way, then this kind of content is best delivered in the group on-campus synchronous space. So I think a lot of what we're trying to do here is switch the emphasis of where who's doing the learning. So again, getting away from you delivering content to students engaging and doing something with that content. So just to provide an example of what this looks like, one of my sessions that I developed, so I've identified that this group of learning content and activities is best delivered in the asynchronous space, and it will somewhat meet either partly or wholly some of these learning outcomes, and then we explicitly build upon this content in the on-campus learning environment. What this can look like in a learning management system build is, I think it's key to share with the learners what the expectations are for the session, again, to align them to your thinking and understanding, and engage them in that way. So share the models, share the plan, and then having a very deliberate structure to the pre-learning content. In this sense, each week they have to watch, read, discuss, and reflect. And as far as the digital learning content goes, it doesn't have to be, if you're creating video content, it doesn't have to be very long. This is a 7-minute video, and I can see from this program that I've got analytics that are showing me it's been viewed 170 times. So if I recall correctly, this was delivered with 2 cohorts of around 30 students each. So the fact it's got 170 views tells me that there's some information in there that students are going back to over and over again. So I need to understand what that is. We have essential readings, which you'll be familiar with. And then we have discussion forum posts that I'll skip over just to keep them anonymous. Okay, then we have the on-campus time, along with the session slides. And then we have some additional content here. Now, this is where I think many educators would start by putting this interesting additional content in their learning management system. But the reality with this is that it doesn't meet any of the described learning outcomes. So it's additional content for those that want to do further study, but not engaging with it won't affect the achievement of the outcomes of the session. Okay, so this was a brief overview of how we can start thinking about designing your flipped learning sessions. It's a very powerful approach. It does come with challenges. There's obviously a lot of work involved in mapping out those outcomes, developing digital learning content. I do personally believe that once it's done, it actually makes your life easier in the long run, but it's something to consider. You might want to start with looking at just developing one session, developing small pieces of content in relation to your outcomes, and then building it over multiple iterations. But it's also worth mentioning that unless your students are aligned to the value of the approach, why you're doing it, what's in it for them, so increased flexibility, development of executive functioning, or let's say lifelong learning skills, then they're less likely to engage in it. So be very explicit as to what you're doing, why you're doing it, what the benefit is for your learners, and don't fall into the trap of covering the pre-session content in the live session time. You got to hold firm, and students will eventually get the idea that by skipping that pre-session content, they're going to be at a deficit somehow. Okay, so let me know how it goes, and I'd be very interested to hear in the comments below if you are applying this strategy.